Today for EMS Trauma Grand Rounds, and we're going to be speaking on sleep deprivation and fatigue, which most of us have experienced if we've worked in a hospital or in EMS agencies. And Josh Wall is going to be speaking to us. He's our educator for AirMed. He's worked in ERs, ICUs, and on flight teams, and has a lot of experience. I'm interested in seeing what I did wrong. Okay.
Thanks, Russ. Well, good morning, everybody. Like Russ said, my name is Josh Wall. I'm the nurse educator for AirMed here at the University of Utah. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak to you all today. Kind of a small group here at the U, but I'm sure there's many of you out there today, so I appreciate you being here and grateful for the opportunity to come and talk to you. Like Russ said, our topic today is sleep deprivation and fatigue, sponsored by Red Bull. No, just kidding. It's this is a very important topic, I feel. I know a lot of you guys do your continuing education on things with trauma, pathophysiology, but I felt sleep deprivation was a really important topic I want to discuss because it's a really important topic for us in the air EMS world. In the last 3 years, since 2008, there have been about 14 fatal crashes with helicopters, and a lot of those have been attributed to sleep deprivation, and I think that carries over to ground EMS. We're just going to talk about some of the finer points of that today. So the objectives for my discussion, we're going to identify some of the short-term and long-term consequences of sleep deprivation, some things that can affect us right now, and some of those long-term effects that will affect us negatively in the long run. And then we're going to discuss some of the pathophysiology surrounding sleep deprivation and how that affects you as EMS providers. We're going to discuss how we can combat some of that sleep deprivation in order to stay safe, not only keep us safe, but our patients safe, and ultimately our families when we go home at night. And discuss some of the hazards of sleep deprivation, and finally discuss how we can stay safe. So those are our objectives for today. I'm sure there's been times that we've all felt like this, where we've had a long day on shift and have face planted into the ground for being so tired. So sleep deprivation, according to the Journal of Emergency Medical Services, defines sleep deprivation as the overall lack of sleep necessary to function. To me, that's a very subjective term because each of us have different sleep requirements, and some of us can do better with more sleep or less sleep, and it just varies. But overall, sleep deprivation is basically the lack of sleep necessary to function adequately in our jobs or at home in our personal lives as well. Some interesting statistics that I found. Higher stress and reduced worker productivity related to sleep deprivation costs about $150 billion a year. And those are attributed to sick time, workers' comp from injuries on the job, and even lawsuits of people getting killed or injured. But $150 billion, and that was back in 2003. So it has quite an impact on our economy just in lost productivity. I'm sure many of you have young children at home. I don't, but studies show that if you have a young child at home, you lose an extra hour of sleep each night. So if you have 2 children, it's probably even more. So that's a consideration there. There was a study done by the National Sleep Foundation back in 2000, and of other respondents, they found that 43%, so almost half, found that daytime sleepiness interfered with their normal activities, not only at home, but at work as well. How many of you have to use an alarm clock at home to be able to get up in the morning? Pretty much everybody. I hate to admit this, but I have to use 2, just because I'm afraid I'm not going to get up. And I know some people that have to use 3. I mean, that sounds a little outrageous, but it happens. And the same studies show that half of Americans cannot get up without an alarm clock every day. And then finally, those with sleep deprivation are twice as likely to feel stressed and tired. And the jobs that we do in EMS, air EMS, in the hospitals, it's a stressful job enough. And when you add sleep deprivation to that, it makes it even worse and increases the likelihood of us not being able to function adequately. So some of the short-term consequences I want to talk about. Another study found that just by losing 1.5 hours of sleep each night, we have a 32% reduction in our daytime alertness. And that, to me, is a lot, especially when you're out there with people's lives in your hands, taking risks every day. To have that loss and not be at 100% just gets us behind the 8 ball and puts us at an increased risk of injury and even death. It can impair our cognitive ability and interfere with the ability for us to process information. And again, when we have people's lives in our hands, that we need to be at our top of our game. And when you're sleep deprived, you're not. You're going to make decisions that you may not normally do if you're more awake, or you may forget to do things that you would normally do as well. Another big thing is it doubles the risk of sustaining an occupational injury. We are at a great risk for what we do. We put our lives at risk every day going out into the community, driving rigs on ambulances, firefighters on their trucks, and EMS providers in the air. Just increases that likelihood of having an injury. For us, one thing that we worry about is walking into the tail rotor of a helicopter. That's a big thing. And you wouldn't think some rotor spinning 800 times a minute would be an issue to walk into, but we've seen people on scene in the middle of the night have just kind of walked up just because they didn't see it. And it's because they've probably been tired. And so we really have to be cognizant of being sleep deprived and make sure that we don't increase the risk of sustaining an occupational injury and contribute to that $150 billion a year in lost wages from being injured or even dying. Another big thing is impaired immune system. I know as a nurse working night shifts, your immune system just gets hashed because you're exposed to everything, you're not getting the adequate sleep that you need, your diet's out of whack, and you get pretty much every disease that you're exposed to. And then finally, visual misperceptions. I'm sure people, when you drive at night, you may see things that are not there or not see things that are there, so that puts us at an increased risk again for having an accident because we are not at the top of our game. I'm sure you guys who drive fire trucks, ambulances have run into this before, especially if you're going on long hauls. You're the only driver up front, your crew's in the back. It's hard to stay awake and be able to drive effectively, and just, again, increases the risk of having an accident or an injury. Some of the long-term consequences that sleep deprivation can lead to, and again, these are a little extreme, but it can happen. You can get high blood pressure, heart attacks, heart failure, and stroke. Again, those are big things, can be an end result of that, but it can happen. A thing that I think we see a lot is psychiatric problems. People get fatigued, they get depressed, they get irritable. I know I see that in myself when I've worked long hours, and some of my coworkers as well, so we need to be cognizant of that. And then mental impairment. That also increases the risk of mortality because we're taking risks that we normally may not do, or we might not be just awake enough to function like we should adequately. If you have are in a relationship with your wife or spouse, relationship problems with your bed partner, you're not sleeping at night, keeping them up at night, and then finally, obesity. Because we're not getting the sleep we need, we're tired, we overeat. It's just this snowball effect that ultimately will affect us negatively. And again, like I said, these may be extreme cases, but think about what leads up to them. The increased stress leads to poor diet, lack of exercise, and then any underlying issues that you may have in your own medical history are exacerbated by having this sleep deprivation and can lead to these more serious things, which we need to try to avoid. So I'm sure there's days we've all felt like this too. So the only thing I think can be worse than sleep deprivation is what we call grogginess, or sleep inertia, excuse me. Let's say that you really try to get to bed early and have good sleep habits, and in our field we know that when the pager goes off, doesn't matter how early you went to bed, you got to be up and ready to go. So I want to discuss a concept called sleep inertia. So it's the feeling of grogginess that most people feel after you wake up in the morning. It can last from 1 minute for up to 4 hours. Typically it lasts 15 to 30 minutes. So if you think about when your alarm clock goes off in the morning, you hit snooze a couple times, that grogginess you feel where you just can't get up out of bed, that's what we call sleep inertia. When you're sleep deprived, that's compounded and makes sleep inertia more prolonged and harder to overcome. A good example I like to think for EMS is when the first snow flies. I hate working in the ER when I did work in the ER when we had the first snowstorm, because people here in Utah forget how to drive. And I know the EMS guys, I felt bad because you were just always on the road, taking care of accidents, extricating people, and doing that all day, and then coming back and finally getting to sleep, and then having your pager go off again at 3 a.m., and you realize that you're awake and you're in your rig and think, whoa, what happened? When did all this happen? So it can be experienced even after a short nap. So we need to be mindful that even if we're taking a little bit of a nap, or we're sleep deprived, that when that alarm goes off, or the pager goes off, or the tones go off, that we're not going to be at our best. And that, again, makes us more at risk for doing things stupid or increasing our likelihood of getting injured or hurt. I want to give you guys an example of a cab driver who was just getting off shift and driving home, and the kind of the negative effects that sleep deprivation and that grogginess and being up all night can have. This here. Maybe. Gotta love technology. I guess it's not going to work. Had a little video clip here of this cab driver. Started to doze off. Went off the side of the road, rolled his car, got ejected. Not very good. So, sorry about that. Wasn't able to give that example there. We'll move on. So, the American Medical Association defines grogginess as being more debilitative than being sleep deprived and that sleep inertia. And it can be more debilitating and dangerous than staying up all night. So think about, again, like we talked about, getting a little bit of sleep and having that alarm clock go off and being awake. You're groggy, and it can be worse than actually staying up at night. 10 ways that they encourage people to combat that grogginess is to get exercise. I know there's been times when I've been on shift for 24, 36 hours, and it's a slow night or slow shift in general. I'm more tired from not doing anything than I am from working back-to-back calls. So we encourage people here at AirMed, when you have time, to go exercise, to kind of just get those endorphins up, and then go take a nap and just kind of keeps you more on that normal pattern that you would be back at home. Taking a cold shower also works well. Drinking coffee in moderation. If you get bored, cook. I know a lot of people in firehouses like to cook, so put your culinary skills to work and cook a meal for everybody. Eating, having an engaging conversation with people. I know on long legs on our flights, on our fixed wing, there's times I know I'm going to fall asleep and I think of our poor pilot up front. And so I will purposely say, okay guys, we're going to play 20 questions, have some kind of conversation here to keep ourselves awake. And I think that's a good idea in your rigs too, to just have an active conversation if you're on a long transport and driving somewhere, to be able to help each other stay awake and decrease the likelihood of having an accident. Driving when the window's open. Might be a good idea this time of year because it's nice and chilly outside, so that'll hopefully keep you awake with a nice brisk breeze. Listening to your favorite music. I wouldn't recommend Enya or classical music because that'll probably put you to sleep, but some kind of heavy metal or something or whatever you like that can help keep you awake. Reading the newspaper, and then again trying to go to bed early and creating good sleep habits if possible. Have any of you heard of the National Drowsy Driving Act of 2002 called Maggie's Law? I wasn't familiar with this either. Basically, it's a law mandated by Congress that says sleep-deprived drivers qualify as reckless drivers who can be convicted of vehicular manslaughter. So even when we're trying to do what's right for our patients, getting up in the middle of the night, driving them, if they find the crash is associated with us being sleep-deprived, we could be subject to this Maggie's Law and be charged with vehicular manslaughter. So it's a serious thing that we need to take into consideration, not only at work, but driving home from work and things in our own personal lives when we're driving around, because we don't want to be responsible. I mean, I can't imagine being responsible for somebody's death just because I was tired driving. And I look back retrospectively, and I'm sure each of you have had instances when you've had long hauls at night and had to drive home, how tired you were. My first flight job was in Arizona, and I used to drive 6 hours each way twice a month. And there were times I'd stay up all night flying and thought, I'll grab a coffee and just drive home. And it was stupid because I could have put somebody at risk. So it's so important for us to recognize when we're tired and either take a nap or do some of the things to combat grogginess so we don't put ourselves and people on the road at risk as well. So moving on to talk a little bit about pathophysiology. I'm sure there's times that we all we'll wish we had a little winder in the back to kind of get us up in the morning and get going. I'm sure you've all heard of the circadian rhythm. So it's physical, mental, and behavioral changes that follow a 24-hour cycle in response to light and the darkness in an organism's environment. So ideally our body is programmed to have the sun come up in the morning, wake us up, get throughout the day. As the sun sets, we go to sleep. Most circadian rhythms can change our sleep-wake cycles, and the hormones that are released in our body temperature, and it's controlled by the master clock that sits above the optic nerve in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Again, in EMS, nursing, fire, we don't have that luxury of waking up at 8 o'clock in the morning, going to bed at night when the sun rises and the sun sets. And I think it's worse this time of year, especially with daylight savings time, because if you're working nights or getting up early, it's dark when you get up and it's dark when you go to bed. So our circadian rhythms are messed up from the get-go, and we're behind the 8 ball as it is. So here's a little diagram of how that works. As light enters the optic nerve, it stimulates that suprachiasmatic nucleus in the optic nerve and sends output rhythms that affect our physiology and our behavior and can help affect that sleep-wake cycle. And this helps regulate our circadian rhythm. And again, it's not always effective in what we do. And daylight savings time, I feel, makes it worse. So by, again, being kind of knowledgeable about that, we can work on addressing that and adapting accordingly. So the master clock in our brain associated with that CNS, for that suprachiasmatic nucleus, is what we call our master clock, and that's what controls the melatonin in our brain. So since that master clock sits above there as light comes into the eyes, that decreases the amount of melatonin and gives us the energy we need to go out throughout the day. And as the sun sets, less light stimulates more melatonin production and makes us sleepy. So if you're up all day doing things and the sun sets at 4:30, your brain's already telling you, oh, it's time to get ready and go to bed. And that's not a reality for us, especially if we're going to be up all night. So less light, more melatonin production equals a sleepy crew. So how does this affect us as helicopter EMS providers, ground EMS providers? There's a lot of things here. The Journal of Emergency Medical Services did a study with sleep deprivation among firefighters and EMS responders and found that sleep deprivation was linked to an increased risk in requiring alertness, vigilance, and quick decision-making. I think those are all factors that affect us in what we do in our jobs. When we get that call, we have to be vigilant, we have to be alert, and we have to make life-saving critical decisions. And if we're sleep-deprived, we're not going to be able to function and do all those things effectively. Long work hours are associated with chronic sleep loss and decrease our ability to think clearly and increase the likelihood of having mental disorders like depression, anxiety, being more stressed, and being irritable. And again, like we said before, that chronic sleep loss can be associated with more physical problems, those long-term and short-term consequences of sleep deprivation, and lead to musculoskeletal problems, being achy all the time. Again, lack of exercise, poor diet, leading to obstructive sleep apnea and obesity. And then heightened our levels of cardiovascular and disease and cancer risks. And again, if you have those underlying factors anyway, because of your genetic makeup, they're just going to be compounded by that. I found it interesting, too, that in this study, they found that only 1/3 of Americans can effectively work sleep-deprived, while 2/3 of us cannot. That's kind of a small fraction, I think, and I think as nurses, paramedics, EMTs, firefighters, we make up a big majority of that. And there's people I know that do that, and they aren't able to function adequately when they're sleep-deprived. So there we go. So again, this goes back to those short-term and long-term consequences of sleep deprivation. It's not only physical, but it can start affecting us psychologically as well. So what can we do to help combat these things? First of all, I think the big key is identifying, first of all, that you're at risk for sleep deprivation by just saying, okay, this is my job, this is how it's going to affect me. You're already ahead of the game there, can do things to try to work on that. You have to ask yourself, are you first willing and physically able to work long shifts? Nurses, we do 12-hour shifts. EMS, 24, 36. I know the Kelly schedule, the modified Kelly schedule, works pretty good for you guys to do that. Most people are successful, but you have to ask yourself, okay, even though I'm doing this, am I physically able to do so? My first flight job, we did 72-hour shifts. We'd have 3 crews on at a time, and we just rotate calls. There'd be times you get called out, have a 6-hour flight, you'd get back, both crews had already flown, and you'd be up in the mix again. I did a 6-day stretch once. Had 14 flights, and it was crazy. And by the end of it, I just didn't even care anymore. I was so tired, and I should have not done that, but at the time I didn't recognize how that was going to affect me and ultimately affect my performance as a healthcare provider there. We need to recognize when we are fatigued and realize that it can affect our ability to adequately care for our patients and put everyone at risk. People on the road, the patients we're caring for, our partners that we're working with, and ultimately our families that are waiting home for us at the end of our shifts. Another thing we can do is try to work to structure our shifts and work hours to meet the needs of not only ourselves, but of the department as well. And I realize that can be pretty tough in the EMS world because there's those set schedules. But if you have the opportunity in your agencies to give feedback on how you may be able to structure those shifts to be able to be adequately rested, go for it. Be an advocate for yourself and for your patients by saying, you know what, these shifts may work, but maybe we can alter them a little bit to enable us to be awake and adequate healthcare providers. At AirMed here, we encourage, well, not only encourage, we mandate that people that are coming onto shift have to have at least 8 hours of rest. So if they've worked a shift before, we don't let them work. Same with nurses and our flight medics, because we want them to be able to come on refreshed to not only take care of patients, but decrease the likelihood of having an accident or putting the team at risk. So what else can we do? Well, I think right now we're doing it. We're providing education regarding the need for healthy sleep habits. Create a culture that acknowledges and supports the need for sleep. So in your stations, if people want to take naps and you allow that, go for it. Create environments that allow people to have a quiet time, even just to get a little downtime to rest as well. Involving employees in decision-making about shift structures and their work hour preference. Again, not always a reality, but if input has been able to be provided, try to do that to see how you can structure it to make it work for you. Can't stress this enough. Proper diet and getting good sleep when you're not there. Proper diet, exercise, that all works in our favor to keep us physically fit and avoid those long-term consequences that we talked about before. And then finally, have fun and a little bit of recreation in your life. I love what I do as a flight nurse. It is my dream job, but I have to take a step back and realize it's just a job. And I can work myself into the ground. And I need to have a good work-life balance at home, so when I come to work, I'm refreshed and charged so I can take care of patients and be safe while I'm doing it. So when we get sleep deprived, fatigued, that can lead to stress. Hopefully that we aren't in real big stressful situations like that. But stress management starts with identifying the sources of stress in our life. So how many of you have had instances where you just explain the stress away? You think, I have a million things to do, I've got this going, the holidays are coming up, I just got to do it. It's just inevitable, and you forget to take a breather. I think we all do that and not even realize it. We just think that's a part of life, and we just go along with it and chalk it up to just being stressed or being busy. We define it as an integral part of our work or home life. Like there's things just going on crazy around here, or I just have a lot of nervous energy, I have to do this, have to do that. And then finally you blame your stress on others or the situations and you say, work's making me stressed because they're making me work all these long hours. These patients, they're calling us too much. Just you're taking that stress and you're projecting it on other people. I know I've been guilty of this before, but these are not normal behaviors, and they must be recognized and addressed in order to be not only healthy, but happy and safe as well. And if we don't recognize these things, we become bitter, we become jaded, and we're just going to not be empathetic healthcare providers. So it's important to realize when we're starting to feel these things and stop ourselves at that time and say, okay, I'm starting to think negatively, what can I do to decrease that stress in my life? Some people, unfortunately, are not able to identify these risk factors and the stress in their life, and they start dealing with things in an unhealthy manner. Smoking, for example. I know a lot of people, when they're stressed, pull out a cigarette, and they keep doing it more and more. They're stressed, and just leads again to those long-term health consequences that we talked about. Drinking, I think, is a big thing, especially among healthcare providers, EMS, and firefighters. When we have a stressful day, we're dealing with death and dying all the time. People turn to drinking, and it's not the best way to handle that, and can again lead to those long-term consequences and start affecting you emotionally as well. Over and under eating, I thought under eating was kind of a neat thing that they mentioned there. The mantra that we have when we're flying is you eat when you can and you sleep when you can, because you never know when you're going to have the opportunity to do either. So we tell people, don't gorge yourself, but take something with you, eat a little bit, have something with you, so if you're feeling tired when you're on a call, you can eat a little something to kind of keep yourself awake. So obviously we want to avoid overeating so we're not bloated and feel like we're going to puke when we're on scene, but we have to eat so we can keep that energy up. Other ways people handle stress unhealthy is they withdraw from their friends, their family, their coworkers when they're on shift. They start to not do the things that make them happy in their life, and that can lead to depression and anxiety, and they fill up every minute of their day trying to avoid facing their problems. They're doing things like drinking, smoking, just to avoid dealing with reality. And finally, they start taking their stress out on others. They're lashing out, and ultimately people can become physically violent. So we want to try to hopefully recognize when we're getting to that point and put a stop to it so we are not hurting ourselves and others that we're working with as well. So in order to recognize these things, we need to learn how to manage stress in our lives by doing something fun. I wouldn't recommend really base jumping off a building, but to each his own if that's what you want to do, and that helps decrease your stress level. More power to you. There's an interesting website called helpguide.org, and it talked about the four A's of dealing with a stressful situation. The first A is avoid unnecessary stress. That's hard for us to do because in our environment, that's all we deal with is stressful times. We deal with people at their worst. So what I try to do is just avoid unnecessary stress in my own life and not bring that into work, because we have enough stress that we deal with on the clock. We don't need to be adding any more to that and compounding our stress. If we can, alter the situation. Again, when we get into these scenes, we're dealing with people, house fires, car accidents, it's really hard to alter that situation, but we just got to try to adapt and make the best of it. And that leads to adapting to that stressor. I think all of us in healthcare are drawn to ER, EMS, flying, because we kind of get to be like MacGyver. We get to figure out the situation and just make it adapt, And finally, accept the things that we can't change. So it's kind of like AA, accept what you can't change and just go with it. So a lot of times you just got to stop and say, you know what, it is what it is. I need to handle it and move on and try not to let it affect you down the road. So for me, there we go. The prime rule of survival, never do anything you know is stupid. It would be something like that. So we need to try to again, stop ourselves in our tracks and think, okay, is what I'm doing going to hurt somebody? By identifying and acknowledging our environment and the reality that there is a problem, we need to adapt and survive. And don't do this, because this is stupid. So how can ineffective management of stress and fatigue negatively affect us? First of all, I think if you're sleep deprived or you just don't care because of the stress in your life, it increases the level of risk-taking that an individual is going to do. In aviation, they have attributed several of the accidents in recent years to fatigue, and that's second only to spatial disorientation. So aside from flying into a cloud bank, they found that people that are fatigued, that's been the reason for crashes and deaths in the air EMS world. Again, what's sad about that is it's preventable, and if we can just recognize those things, these things won't happen. Employers must recognize the work outside of a normal work day. So we don't have the luxury of a 9-to-5 job, and I think our employers recognize that and try to adapt it accordingly to encourage rest for employees, exercise, eating, versus somebody who's at a 9-to-5 job who doesn't really need that as much as we do. Found it interesting, too, that people that are up for 18 to 21 hours continuously have a 25% cognitive reduction in their thinking capacity, which is equivalent to being legally drunk. So you think about doing those long shifts, 24 hours, you're up doing back-to-back calls, you're the equivalent of a drunk. I have a friend did a study because her husband's a cop where they had one person stay up for 48 hours and had somebody else drink, and they had them drive cars out on a closed course. And the guy that was sleep deprived was a lot more reckless than my friend who was legally drunk. So just something to think about. Especially when you're driving home after a long shift. Think, do I need to take a little nap before I go home? Or are you able to drive? Because you're putting yourself at risk and the people on the road as well. There's an interesting mental disorder they called shift work sleep disorder. Have you guys heard of that at all? I had neither before. And so it's a condition in which people who work nights on rotating shifts have a misalignment of their circadian rhythm. So it's characterized by excessive sleepiness at night when you're working, and then insomnia when you're trying to work through the day, or trying to sleep during the day. So your circadian rhythms are all messed up because you're working night shifts, trying to sleep through the day, and you can't. The good news is it's reversible. So on your days off, trying to create a normal sleep-wake cycle, you can hopefully avoid that shift work sleep disorder and get yourself on a normal pattern of sleep. Some stress and fatigue in action. There was a plant explosion in New Haven, Connecticut a few years ago. Killed 6 workers. They went back through and looked at the records and found that these people that died were working 85-hour work weeks. There was a similar plant in Texas that killed 15 workers, and they found out that several of those workers were doing consecutive shifts, 12 hours, 29 days in a row. So, you think about that. And I think the most I've worked is 6 12-hour shifts when I was working in the ICU and the ER and then doing my 6-day stretch. And by the end of it, I couldn't even pronounce my own name. I was so tired. I had a friend who worked in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, had some family issues down there, needed to work and get a little bit of money to help them out. And she said she worked in the ICU. She did 30 12-hour shifts. And by the end of it, she just didn't care. I mean, she hated to say that, but her care was down because her heart wasn't in it, and it put her at risk, and it put her patients at risk too. And she looks back retrospectively now and thinks I should not have done that because I could have killed somebody. Some other stress and fatigue in action. The Journal of Emergency Medical Services, the Association of Professional Sleep Societies, looked back through some of the major tragedies in recent history and found 4 major accidents that they attributed to fatigue. The Exxon Valdez incident happened at 12:15 in the morning. The Bhopal accident happened at 1 o'clock in the morning. Chernobyl happened at 1:23 in the morning. And then finally 3 Mile Island occurred at 4 o'clock in the morning. And looking back, they saw the workers that were there, and they attributed these major accidents to sleep deprivation and fatigue. So it can affect us, and not in a good way. So at what point do we say stop? We have the luxury here at AirMed and flying, and I know a lot of flight programs do that. If we are too tired, we can call a timeout. But I know you guys as EMS providers cannot do that because people count on you to be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So what we can do is, first step, recognizing when you're fatigued and doing something about it. We're not going to be doing our patients any good if we are not at 100%. Plus stress and fatigue and that sleeplessness decrease the ability for us to think cognitively and increase the likelihood of us making mistakes. So if you can first just recognize that, A, you're tired, and doing something about it, I think we can get ahead of that 8 ball and be able to be competent providers and not increase our risk of having an accident. And finally, we just need to take care of yourself so we can take care of others, and that includes in taking care of the people working with you. We have a strong, cohesive team here at AirMed, and 3 of us flying, the pilot, nurse, paramedic, have each other's backs. I think as EMS providers, we need to do that well. If you recognize that your partner's fatigued or not doing well, help them out a little bit. Go give them a nap so they can be at the top of their game and not put everybody at risk. So that's kind of the point I want to drive home to you guys today, that sleep deprivation, I think, is an inevitability in our field, but if we can take the steps to first recognize it and work to combat that, we can keep ourselves safe and get home at the end of the day. So, any questions from the few people that are here right now? Yes, sir.
Can you catch up on your sleep? Have you read anything in your research?
I haven't actually. I think it's pretty subjective. It varies from person to person. I know some people that do crazy shift work and they say 4 or 5 hours, they're back at their game and they don't really need to catch up. I know after working that long stretch, I slept for about 2 days. And then I just try to get back on a normal pattern, even if I have to make myself go to bed at a decent hour to wake up at a decent hour as well. So, any other questions?
About going from days, nights, going back and forth in these rotations, what effect?
Again, I think that's subjective and is dependent on each individual. I know as a nurse I've done that before, and it's tough. But again, you just got to try to create that safe sleep culture. And if you work a night shift, either stay up for the rest of the day or take a little nap and try to get to bed on a normal time to make yourself get back on a normal pattern there. So, yeah.
Hey Josh, thanks for your presentation, but I have one question because you mentioned that you do a timeout.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Can you please explain what that entails and how it can be incorporated into the pre-hospital ground environment?
That's a good question, yeah. So our timeout policy here, basically it states 3 to go, 1 to say no. And that's if you're not feeling comfortable with the flight, if you're too tired and fatigued, if you're doing back-to-back flights. We have a lot of flight physiology aspects that play into our transports. And so being up at altitude, up and down, it really fatigues you. And if you don't get to eat for 6 and 7 hours, because some of our transports last that long, if you don't feel that you're competent and can care for somebody, you just say, you know what, I'm timing out, I need to get a little bit of a rest. We call our flight center and say, hey, we're out of service for a little bit. We need to get some sleep because if we take a flight, we're going to kill somebody. I hate to do that because the reason I'm there is to help people out, but I figure if I'm not at the top of my game, I'm doing nobody any favors at all. How that could be incorporated to ground EMS, I honestly don't know, Janet, because we have that luxury, but EMS people don't. I mean, you can't call 911 and they say, oh, well, nobody's available, they're taking a nap. So I don't know, again, if shifts can be structured to allow for people to get adequate rest. I don't know. I know our accrediting body, CAMES, has really mandated the fact that we need to have rest periods and we cannot work greater than 24 hours. Ground EMS, I'm not sure if they have rules that regulate them in that. So I think each department can do their best to facilitate people getting the sleep they need, offering facilities to exercise, to eat, and creating quiet environments for them to sleep in, and just make the best of the situation that they're in. So.
You mentioned melatonin.
Yes.
I noticed that there's an over-the-counter melatonin product, and you see it in a lot of these teas and stuff like that. Getting people back on their normal rhythm. Is there anything out there on that?
You know, I've known people to take that before. I actually have a good friend that runs a sleep lab up north in Brigham City, and I asked her about that once. I say, you know, you can buy that. People say it works, but she says melatonin is actually not a good thing to take. It's not regulated by the FDA, and it's so much more than the body produces naturally, and the absorption rate is so different that you don't know how it's going to affect you. So it could do nothing, and it could put you to sleep for several hours. So she says it's actually more dangerous to take melatonin than to not, because you just don't know how it's going to affect your body. So if some people have taken it, it works for them, great, but I think creating a good sleep habits and getting the exercise, proper diet, limiting caffeine and alcohol is probably the best thing to do to get yourself back on a normal sleep pattern. So, yes?
From a family medicine perspective, melatonin can be useful, but ought to be taken, your bedtime is going to be 10 or 11, ought to be taken around 7 or 8. And often, I'm trying to remember the units, a lot of people take 5 times physiologic values or amounts. So if you were to say, well, you do want to use it for your sleep cycle, then certainly to consider at least using it at a more moderate dose.
Definitely.
Maybe a way to kind of get the middle ground between what your friend has said and what I've also seen a lot of people do.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And I think if you're going to try it, definitely wait until you're off shift and you have some time to see how your body's going to adjust to it and try to get on a normal sleep-wake cycle so you can maximize the melatonin in your own sleep. So, okay, well, I appreciate you all being here today and for the opportunity to present to you, and thank you very much.